Racist cop detains black man, stunned to discover he's a CIA agent. Seeing a black man in a white area, a racist police officer believes the man is criminal and arrests. Later on, the officer is told he has arrested an on-duty CIA agent James Smith seated in his unmarked vehicle. Automobile engine off, windows slightly cracked to allow in the peaceful, pleasant summer air. Before him rows of very identical homes with precisely cut lawns, white picket fences, and not a soul in sight. He had spent hours observing the house at the end of the cul-de-sac the target hadn't left. James stayed concentrated in mourning, mumbled under his breath. He flexed his hands on the wheel, his senses on great awareness. Alert the suspect. James would know something had gone wrong. He cannot hide indefinitely. James had to move fast. Inside, the sun sunk lower, bathing the golden light. James stayed motionless, ready for anything knowing. Realizing at any instant all could change, Officer Ray Carter drove gently across his patrol area. The motor of the automobile hummed gently in the stillness of the suburban streets. This was a normal day in this section of town. Hardly saw any problems, the kind of place Carter preferred to preserve that way. Neat lawns, clean sidewalks, and the type of those who waved to police as they turned the corner drew his attention. A car without marks. Carter narrowed his eyes. Sitting at the far end of the street, parked somewhat too far from the curb. It was not. He gently craned his neck to obtain a view of the type of car you typically saw around here, too simple and out of place. Look at the black guy alone sitting there. Carter's grasp on the wheel tightened. Lacked any business being here unless he was up. His head started whirling. Someone like that. To whatever he rolled by the car under observation in his rearview mirror. Now, what is this about? Under his breath, Carter murmured. He pulled his cruiser over to the curb a few houses down, leaving ample room. Between him and the car, he radioed in dispatch under a casual unit 2 to 4 heading to visit A. Suspicious car close to Maple Drive, black male in the driver's seat. No obvious plates. I'll look into it more. The dispatcher answered the phone. Carter had already left his cruiser, changing his belt and making adjustments. Sure, his badge was obvious. His mind ran as he approached the automobile, trying to decide how to handle this. Maybe the guy was lost, but Carter questioned it. He had seen this too many times before. Black guy, nice neighborhood, typically didn't end well. He moved gently across the street, looking about. It was too quiet. No one was around to see what was happening, and Carter enjoyed that he was in charge. Whatever happened next would fit his parameters as he approached. The driver's side window, he peered at still, his posture rigid. The man within still, sitting quietly. He looked up and met his eye, but he stayed still. His knuckles tapping on the window did not move Carter. Sharply on the glass, the man seemed not shocked. It irked Carter the wrong way. Afternoon, Carter murmured, attempting to keep. His voice was consistent, but the edge in it was obvious. Clear mind guiding me toward what you are doing here. The man looking to be in. His late 30s coolly rolled down the window. His countenance was tranquil. Controlled. Carter disliked it as well. I am working with the man mentioned above, even though I am employed by the government. Just keeping his hands on the wheel and not moving quickly. On duty, he told Carter. He was used to experiences like this, too used to it. Maybe. Carter frowned. Government. Yes, you got ID to back that up? Yeah, I do. The man responded in the glove compartment. If you wish. Carter didn't even blink. His eyes might reach for it. Suspicion simply made the man more subdued. Individuals like these were not meant to be here, and they surely as hell lacked government employment, at least not ones keeping people seated in automobiles on peaceful streets like these. Carter had seen enough. He moved toward the automobile, hand resting on his belt close to his holster. How about you tell me exactly what kind of government work you are doing here? Avoid making any abrupt changes. The man only glanced at Carter's hand, then back up at his face. I'm on a government surveillance operation. I'm not specific, but I'm supposed. Carter's eyes narrowed. Observation, which is interesting since last I checked we manage things like that around here. Never heard of any federal op going down in my neighborhood. The man's attitude didn't change. You wouldn't hear about it. The tone the man used to address him is almost patronizing. Like Carter, he had no idea what this guy above him, untouchable Carter's jaw, was doing in his own neighborhood. Tightened. Do you mind leaving the car? Carter inquired. his voice more of a command than a question. Descended more forcefully. His eyes stayed steady. His hands remained still on the wheel. I am just doing my job. Carter shook his head, and here my ID is in the glove compartment. Just look at this to clear everything. He could feel the tension rising between them as he got another step closer. I'll tell you what's going to happen. We'll straighten this out momentarily. The man didn't move. He merely stared at the car now and slow after. Carter as though evaluating him on whether to comply or keep fighting. At last the man released his annoyance, barely displaying all right, and remarked softly. Carter observed intently as the man unlocked and opened the door. His motions were slow and methodical, cooperating. Yet there was something about his composure that still annoyed Carter, like this man felt he was in control. Carter's fingers lingered even closer to his holster as he got out of the car, not ready to let that happen. He didn't believe this scenario. Not one bit. The man stood up straight, his hands still clearly visible, but there was something in. Carter the man didn't look like a criminal, but his posture and the way he moved seemed odd. Then, again, Carter had learnt not to rely just on appearances, particularly in relation to a black man seated in an automobile that belonged nowhere. In a neighborhood like this, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not here, not now, hands where I could see them. Carter directed his voice, becoming more forceful and commanding. The man complied, but his eyes never left. Carter's cool-headedness was almost as if he had gone through this identical sequence before, and that only made Carter angry. The man was under custody now, and whatever his narrative was, Carter was going. Soon enough, James stood beside his car, hands raised, slightly observing calm. Officer Ray Carter. Look he would have gone through before, far too often the same pattern. He understood the same tension. He knew saw in Carter's eyes the way an officer's body language changed as suspicion took hold. His hand hung close to his waist. This was not going to go as planned. Carter stepped forward to shorten the space between them. Now, let's try this once more. His tone seemed almost patronizing. James maintained his voice steady. What are you actually doing here? I have already mentioned a government monitoring operation. You officer, I have identification in the glove compartment that will clear all this out for federal monitoring. Carter repeated, his doubts thick. That's practical, and you simply happen to be seated in this pleasant neighborhood without. James could sense the heat in Carter's comments, but he did not react as plates on your car watched over everything. The only way I could get through this look was to remain calm. I am not here to start trouble. Just verify my ID, and you will find. Carter shook his head gently, as though he had heard this all before. I bet you have a real. Though convincing narrative individuals like you usually do does not explain why you are just sitting here in this. James's jaw tensed, but he maintained his voice. People like me know what this area looks like. I mean, Carter's gaze wandered over James, sizing him down. You belong nowhere here, and unless you want this to go worse, I have a job to do. Thus, I advise you to stop chatting and start doing the allegation hung in the air, thick and familiar. James had heard it before in several versions, from several individuals. You belong nowhere. It was always the same cop I am attempting to work with. James continued, keeping his hands in sight. I am not posing a threat to you, and I am not breaking any laws. Let's not escalate. This Carter grinned, his eyes glinting with a mix of conceit and something worse. You could say I'm escalating. This is only my duty to ensure that this area remains safe from non-native residents. Are you going to? James's tolerance was dwindling. Let me check the car. Do I have to put you in cuffs? He could sense the tension building, but he had to remain calm. He couldn't allow this to develop into something more, since none is needed. Right there, take a look. You'll see I'm exactly where I should be. Carter's smirk vanished. My ID is right there, replaced with a harder edge. You seem to be some type of unusual instance, hence I will just accept your word for it. I do not. What you're doing here, I notice a man in a neighborhood not having any plates in his car, not belong, trying to behave as though he has something to hide. James shook his head slightly, frustrated. His best efforts. I'm not hiding anything. You wouldn't mind if I looked about, Carter replied, approaching closer to. James's voice fell strong but under control. I am on a federal operation. Hence, if you interfere with anything, This may compromise something more than any of us, Carter laughed at. Federal policies lacked humor. Operation, really you expect me to think that guys like you, he stopped. Then shrugged, let me put it this way. You're a guy who doesn't care what tale you're spinning right now. Acting suspicious. That's all I need to know, James observed closely. I want no trouble, but... Carter's eyes hardened. The only error I see here is you're thinking you could pull one over on me. Now stand back from the car, James neglected to move, focusing steadily on. The officer was precisely planning his next action. He knew where this was headed, having been here before in circumstances involving. When the hue of his skin spoke louder than anything he could say, final chance. Calm thinking didn't count. Carter murmured, his hand dropped near his holstered step back. James inhaled gently to let the irritation pass. Deep inside him, controlled but present. This doesn't have to go like this, oh, but Carter said, his voice pouring. With finality, I know exactly what's happening here. You think because you use some beautiful words, but I'm backing off, but right now I'm in charge. James stared at him, realizing there was nothing left. Saying this meant that the focus was now on power, about control, and not on protocol or reason or facts. Carter wasn't going to give it up. I'm simply asking you to check James's ID gently and get back. Carter hovered his palm over his holster. Then his posture became stiff. James retreated, his hand still clearly visible, knowing at this moment complying was his only choice. Carter was not listening. The issue was too far gone. James felt the weight of his step back. Everything is weighing down on him, the routine, the presumptions, the sense of being reduced to something less than he was. No matter what he said or did, it was a load he had carried for years, but it never got lighter. Carter approached the car, his eyes dart over the inside. You will be standing just there when I look around. Received it. James didn't reply. He only watched as Carter leaned in to search the car, using slow motions. Almost eager, it made no difference if he explained himself. It didn't matter that his ID was within arm's reach. All that mattered now was that Carter had already formed his opinion. The officer straightened after a moment, turning. Returned to James, seeming self-satisfied. Nothing strange. You still have some explaining to do, James's. His composure vanished, but his patience vanished. Carter stared him in the eye. Your voice low. You're wrong, and this is going to catch up with you. Carter snorted. Sure it would, but right now I'm the one giving the instructions. James gazed at him, mute, resolute. He knew this wasn't done. Not by a long shot. James tightened his jaw, his muscles tensing. He wanted to maintain cool, keep his head down. Yet, Officer James's conceit was intolerable. He spoke. You're making a mistake. I've been nothing but cooperative. I've informed you who I am, why I'm here, and where. Steady but firm. All you have to do is look cooperative. Carter shot back, his credentials, voice becoming more forceful. You believe this is cooperative, sitting in a car in a neighborhood you do not belong in? Having me go through all this difficulty? He shook his head. People like you always have a narrative. I've heard them all there. People like you. James experienced once more a familiar fire in his chest, mixed with irritation and anger. Learned to conceal throughout the years. It was not only about this one moment, but also about all the moments similar to this one that quell the mistrust based on presumptions. You are mistaken, James said softly, his voice tense. When you know it's too late. Carter's features twisted into a grimace. James met his eye, not backing down. It's not a threat. Rather, it's the truth for which you are threatening. James maintained his posture, but he could feel the two guys locked in a quiet struggle of will. On the other side, Carter was bristling, his arrogance suddenly changing into weight of all pushing down on him. Carter said, his voice dropped an octave, his hand moved to his full-blown aggression. He could not let it go. Turn around. Now, the holster lying on it not only hovered but also turned around. James's heart rate accelerated, but he remained still. Officer, I'm not resisting. This is going too far. Look at my ID. I'm done with your ID, Carter snapped. Now, James hesitated for a hand, now clutching his tool of power. Spin around and place your hands behind his back. Knowing how dangerous things had gotten, he might demand that Carter follow procedure, but at this point demand that he reverse. Point he knew would simply intensify the incorrect action and word choice, therefore worsening the situation. He turned slowly, showing his hands, and realized this was not about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about power. Carter wanted to demonstrate his control, and James had to follow his pulse pounding. In his ears, Carter felt the shame sinking in his hands behind his back moved fast harsh. James gasped as the cold metal shackles cut into his skin after grasping his wrists and whipping them around. But he remained silent. The piercing snap of the handcuffs felt like the last note in this drawn-out symphony of injustice. You notice how simple it was, Carter said, his voice thick with self-satisfaction. All you had to do was cooperate from the start, and this wouldn't have gone so far. James stood still, unwilling to react. He could feel Carter's breath on the back of his neck, while the officer patted him down in quest of something that could explain what he had recently done. Naturally, his quest, Carter yanked, was unsatisfactory. James braced himself, his body tensing, toward the patrol car, pressing him violently against the door. Carter pulled him into the rough plastic seat. The inside of the patrol cruiser was cool against his back. James could hear Carter chatting to himself as he returned toward the front, choking the thick and heavy air. The words meant nothing but the click of those shackles, the finality of it resonating in James's head. James observed his Carter broadcast, something likely in boasting to his dispatcher about the window. Suspect, he had just detained James, laid his head back on the seat facing the car's roof. Mind was running not with dread, but with a kind of deep, tired rage. He had done everything correctly. He had complied with his voice calm sought to explain. Still here, he was shackled in the rear of a police cruiser handled as a criminal for no other explanation save Carter's own prejudice. He returned to the car, turning on the ignition and peering at James in the rearview mirror, said nothing except grin, the same haughty look he had used from the beginning. One in his mind, having put James in his place as they turned away from the curb. James gazed out the window at the serene, tree-lined streets of the neighborhood, the same streets where others like him did not fit. Feel the weight of Carter's conceit falling on him, but there was no fear, only a cold, seething fury. Carter might have had his flash of insight, but James recognized the truth, that this would not mark the officer's path forward. Carter would eventually see the seriousness of his error. When they left James mute, he drove off. Mind already organizing the next actions, he would remain calm and in control. This was not yet over. James sat at the rear of. His gaze stayed riveted on the world passing while the cold metal handcuffs stung his wrists in the patrol cruiser. Beyond the window, peaceful streets, immaculate homes flawlessly kept. Lawns, the irony of it all wasn't lost on him. These individuals had no idea what had just happened in their quiet little. For James, this was yet another reminder of how things might have gone. For others, this was just another day. Turn on a dime in spite of his experience, his training, and the years he had lived through. Since he didn't belong, Carter, he was considered like a criminal, protecting people like the ones in these houses here. Drove silently for some time, his pleasure evident in the little space of the automobile. Every so often, James Carter believed he could see him barely smiling at the corners of his mouth as he looked in the rearview mirror. Had won. He felt he had done his duty, but James understood the man's conceit was nearly intolerable. But James wasn't shaken. He has gone through more than this, much worse. The cop car stopped at a red signal, and Carter reacted for the radio, scooping it up with a lazy wrist motion. "This is Unit 24, he remarked. Voice cool and confident. "I'm bringing in a suspect, black man, without ID, suspicious conduct in a limited space." James tightened his lips. Even now, Carter was distorting the truth. Even now, James remained silent, since he knew the truth would come out, and it sounded like he had been justified in his behavior. Not too long later, the radio hummed with static, and the dispatcher's voice emerged. "Copy that, Unit 24 sent through the suspect's information for processing." Carter stopped, staring back at James once again in the rearview mirror. He said with an air of finality, like he had just closed the book on James. He stayed mute, glancing out the window. He wasn't not his responsibility to make this simple. Carter sighed, flipping open any additional information about to volunteer anymore. Notepad he had taken from his pocket earlier. James Smith remarked, reading it off with the same contempt. Utilized since the start, no ID claims he is under some form of federal monitoring, but I do not buy it there was a long stop on. Carter Fred's forehead slapping the steering wheel angrily sends you elsewhere than normal on the other end of the radio. Still there, static crackled for a bit before the dispatcher's voice returned, this time with a more austere tone. Hold on, Unit 24 putting that name through our system. James observed Carter in the rearview mirror and could see the stillness stretched on the tension in the car rising with a faint frown replacing officer's smile. Then the radio came up once more. Unit 24. Are you sure about that name? Carter's hold on the steering wheel tightened, his fingers tapping frantically. Yeah, I'm sure, James Smith. Why? Another stop let James witness Carter's confidence faltering. Unit 24. James has a flag on that name. Smith is a federal agent, CIA. Repeat. The words hung in the air like a sudden drop. James watched as Carter's face turned white. His smile vanished totally for the first time since the Carter appeared self-conscious. His mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged. Say again. Carter eventually managed to say, his voice now strained. CIA, the dispatcher's voice returned firmer this time. Affirmative. Unit 24. Smith is with the CIA. You need to release him right away. We'll take care of the rest from here. Carter's eyes expand and now show a mix of uncertainty and anxiety. James caught his eye. His face calmed, his eyes steady. He did not must say anything. The truth was already revealing. The patrol car was silent for a brief period. The weight of as reality fell on Carter James, he could see the wheels in the officers had attempting to ascertain what. The arrogance, the swagger, all of it vanished in an instant, leaving. I knew. Carter stuttered, his voice. He had nothing except the reality he had just produced. Shaky. You didn't care to know, Carter gulped. James cut him off, his voice hard and strong. His fingers trembled slightly as he fumbled with the radio, his face flushed with a mix of shame and dread. He spoke once more. This is Unit 24. I will release the suspect. Copy here. That copy arrived from the dispatchers. Curt and professional. Make sure it's done immediately. Carter dropped the radio back into the console. Momentarily stunned in quiet, James could hear his breathing erratic. The officer turned in his seat to face James, the smile long gone replaced with a hollow look of sorrow. His confidence had broken. Carter started, his voice low, almost begging. I didn't know. I mean, if I had known. James cut him off once again, this time. You said nothing specifically. His voice was quiet, but full of weight. I advised you not to pay. Carter's face reddened, his hands slightly as he grabbed for the. James moved slightly as he swiftly got out of the car and walked to the rear, opening the door. Carter stopped, his hands hovering above the cuffs for a time. He did not shift his eyes. Ran from James's face to the cuffs around his wrists, as though not aware of how to save them. Then Carter fumbled carefully with the keys, unlocking the handcuffs, thereby releasing James from the bonds. The metal dropped with a dull clink, yet the weight of the moment stayed. Carter stepped back, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing as though he wants to offer an apology, EXP justification, anything to improve it. James just stared at him, his countenance blank. However, there was nothing he could say to make things right. Carter faltered, clearly disappointed in his gaze. I'm sorry. James didn't answer. He didn't need the truth. The quiet between them said more than words could possibly allow him to straighten his. Flexing his wrist as the circulation came back, he left the patrol car without more word. James broke the silence between him and Officer Carter and left Carter stunned. Was dense and weighty, like a cloud neither of them could flee from as James left the patrol car, his rear. Straight, his steps measured Carter, anchored in place, still clutching the keys to the cuffs just around. James's wrists were pale. The officer's face was pale. His breathing was erratic. His mind was racing to attempt to understand what had occurred. Happened, and most crucially, what was about to happen next. James didn't be looking back. He didn't need to, he knew precisely what Carter was expecting. As he made his way to his car, the quiet suburban street felt even more subdued, as though the officer's error had weighed down the entire community. Carter at last broke out from his daily routine, his fingers still shaking. Hurrying back to his patrol cruiser, he stumbled with the radio and said, breaking somewhat, Unit 24, I have freed James Smith, the suspect. Free, there was a little stop on the other side before the dispatcher answered with a clipped voice and, "Professional copy for Unit 24, stand by for more directions." Carter looked at, his heart thumping in his chest. He understood what additional instructions meant. He knew this wasn't something that would blow over with a little apology. While he waited, his thoughts repeated everything that had just transpired the instant he saw James was seated in that car. His presumptions led him to overlook every warning flag due to the man's skin color, since he had persuaded himself he was acting morally, but now reality was. Unit 24 reports back to the station. Immediately, supervisor wants to talk. Plunging in the radio crackled once more. "With you over, Carter." His mouth felt dry, and his hands, once confident, now shook violently. "Copy that," he managed to say, his voice almost audible. He turned back at James, now standing next to his car. Changing his jacket as though nothing had happened, Carter's stomach turned over the strength he had experienced just a minute ago. He climbed into his patrol car and sat there while staring blankly, evaporating, leaving him with just fear. He could feel his career slipping through his fingers at the dashboard. Everything he had worked for, he had created it. He knew the results of his actions were unavoidable, and they were. Started the car and pulled away from the curb. He couldn't get the picture of James's serenity as he hit him hard. Firm face from his mind. He had been wrong, terribly wrong, and now he had to face the music when Carter returned. The atmosphere at the station was different. His fellow cops did not extend the customary nods, or there was a tension in the air that informed him they knew he hadn't yet entered, and that casual waves had a stiffness. Already the whispers were spreading. He passed through the station doors with heavier steps than before, his head down. Word flew swiftly as he passed the front desk and grabbed the eye of the receptionist. She hastily turned away. Carter flinched, his piercing voice of his supervisor, Captain Hill, pierced through the air like a blade. Too fast. Heart pounding. He turned to find the captain facing his office door, arms crossed his face, mask of. Carter's legs felt weak as he made his way to the office, and stern disappointment entered here. He could see eyes of his associates on him, felt as though the fluorescent lights overhead, harsh and unforgiving, were closing in the walls. Unforgiving, this was the moment he had been fearing since he left the scene. Now he walked. There was no dodging it now. Into Captain Hill's office. The door closed softly. The space was plain, and the only decorations were framing certificates and accolades all around the walls, none of which would have comforted Carter. Captain took a seat behind his desk and fixed Carter with a stare that made it quite evident this was not a regular talk. Downhill directed, his voice low but strict. Carter followed, declining himself into the. Hill could feel the stress, making it difficult to breathe. He could feel the sweat developing on his hands across from the desk. Didn't talk for a while. Instead, he turned to face Carter as though he were choosing where to start at last. Leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Reveal what happened outside. Hill's voice icy. Carter gulped, trying to absorb. His ideas were misinterpreted. I fumbled. I didn't realize he was with the CIA. That's not what I questioned. Hill cut off, his voice sharply. What happened from the minute you halted that car till the moment you cuffed a federal agent on assignment? Explain yourself. Carter's throat grew dry. He could feel the weight of his mistakes. Every word he tried to articulate stopped in his throat, and I saw him collapsing down on her. He started, his voice shaking, while seated in the automobile. I believed he was suspicious since he lacked plates, and he. Hill's eyes narrowed, his demeanor hardening. He did not appear like he belonged there. Belonged? That's why. Carter trembled at the question, knowing how awful it sounded. I simply wanted to know. I didn't know you didn't know. Hill repeated, his voice rising louder. I thought I was doing morally. Didn't know, as you showed no interest in listening to a man inform you he was on a federal operation, displayed his credentials, and you disregarded him. You cuffed him, thrown in the rear of your automobile. Now this department is going to deal with the fallout from your error. Carter's cheeks flushed with guilt. He had no defense. Now Hill leaned back in his chair and shake his head. This department cannot afford officers acting on presumptions. Do you know? You have put an entire operation under danger by causing damage to the CIA that is breathing down our necks. I didn't plan for things to go this. You didn't stop and consider. I'm sorry. Carter murmured, his voice hardly heard. Hill's voice softened somewhat, but the disappointment stayed. Sorry. Not going to cut it. Carter sensed his emotions and crossed a line we cannot undo. Sink knew what was next. You're suspended, Hill said, his voice frigid. Finn turned in your direction. Badge and your weapon. Lucky if suspension is all you get. Carter's mouth grew dry, his eyes wide with amazement. You're lucky you're not fired right away, Hill remarked, but we'll let the review board determine that. Now turn in. Carter's hands shook as he reached for his badge, unhooking it from his belt. He left here. As he stood up to leave, Carter, fingers shook as he set it on the desk, the metallic clink resonating through the room. Felt a hollow emptiness settle in his chest. He had gone from under control, the one issuing commands, to being stripped of everything he felt made him who he was. He had no one to blame except himself. As he left the station head down, he could sense the eyes staring at him, the weight of their criticism following him with every action. Their quiet condemnation followed. This was the result of his activities. There was no way to avoid it now. Carter was outside the station, the door closing behind him with a hefty thud. Left on the pavement, staring blankly at the street his badge was gone from. The weight of the day's events seemed to him stripped, exposed, as though the clothing he still wore no longer belonged to him. Squeezed tightly with every breath, he peered about, pressed down on his shoulders like a vice, looking for something, known something to ground him, but all he could feel was the creeping knowledge of how much he had lost. His hands shook. People passed him going about their daily business, while at his sides a cold went down his spine. The day was warm. Unaware of the internal tempest awry through him, Carter inhaled deeply to help him to ground himself. He had never felt this. Before, it was always him in control, giving the commands, making calls. Now he had kind of helplessness. Nothing he had caused his presumptions based on his haughtiness and his incapacity to see past his own prejudices strip everything away. Strolled slowly toward his car in the station lot. His legs felt weak under him. Normal authority he carried was replaced with a lifeless hollow as he stopped his hand on the driver's side of the automobile. Door handle, he stood there staring at his reflection in the window, his face pallid, his eyes big and distracted. He hardly knew himself. The radio call, the dispatcher's voice exposing James Smith's identity, still echoed in his mind. CIA agent who had arrested a federal agent on duty. The weight of it was too great to bear. He had crossed a line he could never uncross for what a thought James didn't belong in that community brought about. The reality had struck him more forcefully than any blow could have. At last, Carter unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. His knuckles became white as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind scrambling to locate anything at all that would explain his actions. But he had no reason or justification for what he had done. His own prejudice explained nothing. Control his behavior. Suddenly, his phone rang in his pocket and cost him everything. He ignored it. He couldn't face the calls or texts from his family's coworkers. What could he even say to them to indicate he had destroyed his career in a few minutes, that he had let his hubris and prejudices strip him of what he had worked for? Trembling hands, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out his police-supplied notepad. The pages were loaded with names, records on arrests he had committed over the years. At one point, he had been glad of this, his record of service proving he was a decent cop who kept the town secure. Now, as he turned around, all he could see on the pages was his blindness, the faces of the people he had halted, questioned, and caught throughout the years, confused together in his mind. How many of them had felt the same way James did that day? How many times has Carter assumed guilt based on nothing more than a gut feeling, a sensation that someone didn't belong? He had assured himself he was doing his job, but now in the aftermath felt hollow. Empty. Carter closed the notebook and threw it onto the passenger seat. His phone buzzed once more, but this time he pulled it. Glancing at the screen, he noticed a message from his wife. He briefly focused on it, experiencing a new surge of what was he going to tell her that he was suspended from, and that he was probably going to be sacked due to the once a public humiliation. Guy she considered as a hero suddenly found himself unable to bring his fingertips over the screen. He answered himself, then slid the phone back into his pocket and rested his head against the steering wheel, closed his The weight of the day was breaking him, and for the first time in his career, he felt absolutely helpless within them. The mood was tight. News had gone fast about what had happened. Officials murmured among themselves, several peeks at the door awaiting the next development. None mentioned it loudly. Carter's career, once so bright, had come to an end in quite unambiguous terms. In the captain's office, Hill sat behind his desk with a stack of papers in front of him. He was not unfamiliar with managing disciplinary measures, but this one was unique. The fallout from Carter's conduct would not only influence the department, it would sweep over the society via public view of the police force as a whole. Racial profiling, abuse of authority, mishandling a federal agent, these were things that would permanently damage the department's standing. Hillside massaging his temples as he examining the incident report. It was abundantly evident from the start that Carter had acted out of prejudice rather than evidence-based knowledge. Neglected to ask the appropriate questions. Instead, he had allowed his presumptions guide him directly into Hill remarked, his voice fatigued. Captain. Disaster. The phone on his desk rang, and he grabbed it up. Hill came with the voice on the other end of the review board, seeking instant termination. Nodded even though the caller couldn't see him. I assumed as much. Make sure the documentation is ready. This has to be addressed. Hill slumped back in his chair, gazing up at the ceiling. He had seen competent cops cleanly hanging up the phone. Fell before, but in the end his pride and his actions stung more. Carter had been one of the promising ones. Years later, Carter still sat in his car, his thoughts numb from prejudice bringing him down. He had been dropped. His phone buzzed once more. This time, he barely above a whisper. Carter answered, knowing who it was before he even heard the voice of the other end. Officer Carter. Hill come through, strong but not enraged. You are formally kicked from the force based on decisions reached by the review board. Carter closed his eyes immediately. The word struck him like a blow to the chest. He had knew was approaching, but hearing it loudly made it true. I understood. Carter answered, his voice flat, impersonal. I need you to come back in and complete the documentation. Hill kept going. You're free to go. Carter nodded, even though Hill couldn't see him. I will be there. As he hung up the phone, Carter remained silently for a long period, staring out the windshield. His career was over, but more than that, his sense of self was destroyed. Everything he believed he understood about his job, about what it meant to be a good cop, had been snatched away in a flash. He started the car, the engine whirling to life, and pulled out of the lot. The station faded far behind him, and he couldn't get rid of the sensation as he drove out. James Smith stood next to his car for a moment and lost not only his employment, but also his sense of who he was. James let himself breathe deeply, allowing the tension to release from his body. It had been a long, tiresome day, and though the weight of the encounter still pushed down on him, the immediate threat was past. He'd changed his jacket. The handcuffs the sting left behind caused him to feel residual pain in his wrists, which reminded him of how readily. Even now, after all these years, events may go wrong, and events like this brought back memories. James closed his eyes for a second, studying some people would never see past the surface. The same old truth. He looked down the street toward the house, unable to let this trip him. He still had work to do. He had been observing all afternoon, the house still under his first focus. The operation had almost been compromised. Carter's actions caused James to lose concentration. Nevertheless, it wasn't over, since so much was at risk. James broke the silence by pulling his phone out and looked at the screen. It was a message from his superior. Everything on your end is apparent. James looked at the screen for a moment before responding, all obvious now. It was the truth despite the anarchy of the day. The mission was still intact, but behind those words James had come out from something deeper. Though physically unharmed, this contact served as another reminder of the struggle he had been waging. He placed the phone away and focused on the house. There was still work to be done, and he couldn't let Carter's actions divert him from the greater picture. He climbed back into his automobile, the familiar seat felt under him. The security cameras still hummed softly. The house across the street stayed silent, the suspect inside. Not knowing of the almost catastrophic event that had just occurred, James inhaled once more and concentrated. He had AOB to complete as he sank back in his head to recreate the confrontation with Carter. In his brain, the mistrust in the officer's voice, the anxiety rising with every instant, the chilly. James knew he had been in that position before metal of the handcuffs digging into his skin. Probably wouldn't be the last given his position and years of service, even if his. James was not furious. He had been reduced to nothing more than a dubious figure in the wrong place at the wrong moment. He had discovered long ago how to handle such kind of unfairness and how to let it pass without allowing it overtake him. His wrath would not help him in the field. Rather, the disappointment that permeated others would be more beneficial. Like Carter in the system designed for him, and in the innumerable others assuming without ever stopping to listen. He had seen too many cops who acted first and later persuaded they were acting morally. Carter had been one of them. He had felt he was in charge. James had known from the beginning that his power would always be insufficient to explain his acts. Did still as James observed the home, he couldn't get rid of the impression that something else had changed Carter. Gone, but the effects of what had transpired would not vanish so readily. So, the system would not stop running, and officers such as Carter would visit and bring with them personal prejudices of own. Presumptions, and James would carry on working in a society where his skin tone made him a target just as. Though his skill set hitless made him valuable, he modified the rear-view mirror to catch a look of himself. His looked serene but exhausted. The sun was starting to set, and the neighborhood was glowing orange. It was quiet. Here is the kind of peace people like Carter thought they were preserving, yet peace created on ignorance wasn't peace at all. It was a delicate illusion ready to be dashed with a single moment of truth. James's phone buzzed. Once more, this time with an update on the operation he examined, rapidly recording the specifics the suspect was still carrying. Inside, not moving yet good. He leaned back in his seat, staring at the house. There was still time. Having adapted to the usual cadence of monitoring, his mind became clear now, concentrated on the current work at hand. The procedure came first always, but as the minutes passed, he couldn't help but think of Carter once again, of how different. Had the cops simply listened in the end, Carter had lost everything since he couldn't see. Things could have been different. Transcending his own prejudices, James saw it in his eyes the instant the truth struck him. The knowledge that he had committed a mistake he could not undo. It was not James's responsibility to mentor him that lesson. He just had to finish what he had begun to safeguard. He had no obligation to mend a failing system. He looked around the house one more time to make sure everything was still in order before his part came in. James stayed alert as he leaned back in his seat. The evening air was cooler now. The neighborhood was silent. His body relaxed, but his thoughts keen. People like Carter would always exist, and there would always be occasions like the one they had shared. James was here to perform his duties, and nothing, not even a poor cop, would have bothered him. Having a chip on his shoulder would prevent him from acting as the sun at last sank beyond the horizon. James let himself a little peaceful breath. The job wasn't finished, but he had weathered. Shadows James cast on the pavement. Still here, the storm he was in was still poised for whatever next, and that in the end was all that counted. Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.